The weight of my loneliness felt like an unspoken prayer, echoing in the hollow spaces of my mind, desperate for an answer I couldn't quite hear. I never expected to find solace in a stranger's words, let alone something that made my skin crawl as much as it comforted. That rainy Tuesday, I sat in the corner of the small-town cafe, my fingers tracing the worn edges of my coffee cup while the world outside blurred into a watercolor smear of gray and wet. The scent of roasted beans and damp pavement mingled, filling the air with a quiet familiarity that only deepened my hollow ache. The cafe was nearly empty, save for the distant hum of the heater and the occasional drip of water from the window's ledge. I was lost in a book I'd read so many times I could almost recite it backwards, when I noticed him. He sat across from me, yet somehow it felt like he was sitting inside my head. His presence was unassuming, leaning slightly forward, eyes fixed on my face as if he could see through my skin, through my words, into the shadows I kept buried. He reached across the table, and I flinched slightly, but he only touched the corner of my hand with an oddly gentle gesture. His touch was cool, like the first frost of winter, and I felt a strange jolt, as if a current had slipped beneath my skin. "You look like you're waiting for something," he said softly, voice smooth but carrying an odd timbre that made my skin prickle. There was a rehearsed warmth in his smile, but his eyes held a flicker of something else, something unreadable, distant, yet intensely focused. I wanted to pull away, to retreat into my carefully constructed solitude, but I didn't. Instead, I nodded, feeling the flickering light above us cast shadows that danced like restless moths around his face. It was almost poetic, the way he seemed to hover just on the edge of reality, as if he belonged to some other realm I wasn't meant to understand. He leaned in slightly, his gaze unyielding, and said, "You're exactly where you're supposed to be. Sometimes the universe knows more than we do." It was a compliment, I suppose, but it sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced those words in front of a mirror. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten, as if he knew something I didn't, something that should have been kept hidden. His eyes lingered too long, and I caught a glimpse of a glint, like a shard of glass reflecting a fractured memory. I shivered, instinctively pulling my hand back, but he only smiled wider, as if my reaction pleased him. I wasn't sure whether it was his words or the way he looked at me, but I felt a strange pull, a magnetic current that seemed to draw me closer and push me away all at once. Then he spoke again, voice low and almost whispering. "There's more to your story, I can see it. And I know where it's headed." His words hung in the air, heavy with promise and warning, like a forgotten poem falling silently between us. I didn't answer, only stared, my mind racing with the flickering images of the moment, trying to grasp what was real and what was just a shadow cast by his presence. As I watched him, I felt a chill that wasn't entirely from the cold rain outside. Something in me woke up that night, something I should have left asleep. And deep down, I knew this encounter was no coincidence. It was a trap, woven from the threads of my own loneliness, and the quiet darkness I refused to admit was always waiting just beneath the surface. He remembered the little things I mentioned, the way I liked my coffee, the book I was reading, even the song I hummed when I was lost in thought. Later, he would bring up those details as if they had been etched into his memory, making me feel seen in a way I never had before. It was like he was quietly stitching himself into the fabric of my life, one thread at a time. And I found myself craving that feeling of being understood, of being chosen by someone who truly listened. One evening, he shared a story about himself, a vulnerable confession about a loss he had endured, something raw and painful. I watched as his voice softened, and I realized he was mirroring my own need to be heard, to be understood. It was as if our wounds were aligning, making our connection feel scarred but real, somehow sacred. I began to believe that this bond was rare, almost fated, like the universe had conspired to bring us together in this quiet moment of mutual understanding. He often praised me in ways that felt oddly possessive, but disguised as admiration. "No one sees the world like you do," he would say softly, his eyes lingering a little longer than necessary. It was a compliment, I told myself, but beneath it, I sensed a quiet assertion, an unspoken claim. I found myself answering him faster, eager to keep his attention, to prove I was worthy of his praise. I canceled plans, rearranged my days just to be near him. convincing myself that my devotion was a choice, a gift I was giving freely. He would ask almost casually, "Do they really know you like I do?" His voice was gentle, but I caught the subtle question lurking beneath. Who was I texting? Who was I talking to when he wasn't around? I brushed it off, rationalizing that it was just his way of showing care, of wanting to protect what was ours. I told myself that his concern was love. Nothing more, nothing less. One evening he handed me a small gift, a single flower, its petals matching the tattoo I wore on my wrist. I was surprised, touched, and a little uneasy at how precise he had been in choosing it. When I looked at him, he simply smiled and said, "This makes me feel closer to you." His hand brushed mine, a featherlight touch that lingered longer than comfortable, sending a strange shiver down my spine. I found myself mirroring his gestures unconsciously, our movements syncing in a quiet, rhythmic dance I didn't quite understand. We sat together in silence, the room thick with unspoken words. I felt exposed, like a fragile glass left in the sun. My mind spun. Was this love, or was I slowly surrendering myself to something darker? I started answering him faster, answering his needs before I even knew what they were. I canceled plans without hesitation, eager for his approval, craving the warmth of his attention like a dying ember. Sometimes, I wondered if I was losing myself, if this obsession was protection or prison. I told myself I was safe, that what we had was special, that I was finally understood. But beneath that reassurance, a small voice whispered doubts, warning me that I was building walls around my heart without even realizing it. I felt like I was disappearing into him, losing pieces of who I was, and I couldn't shake the thought that this might all be a fragile illusion. If obsession feels like protection, then am I ever really safe? And as I looked into his eyes, I wondered, how much of me was left to find? My days started to feel like a watercolor left in the rain. Colors bleeding into each other, edges dissolving into a hazy blur I couldn't quite grasp. It was as if my world was shrinking, the once clear lines of my routine fading into a fog that only he seemed to navigate perfectly. The subtlety was what made it dangerous. He'd show up unexpectedly, claiming he was just nearby, and suddenly, I'd find myself adjusting my schedule, rearranging my plans, as if his presence had become a necessary part of my existence, even when I didn't ask for it. He would send voice notes during the day, checking in obsessively, like a silent shadow that knew every move I made. Where are you now? Who are you with? The questions were soft, but the tone was insistent. It was as if my independence was an illusion, something fragile he was gently eroding with every message. Sometimes, I caught myself hesitating before replying, second-guessing whether I was overreacting or if I was simply forgetful. It was hard to tell what was real anymore. He began suggesting I spend less time with friends or family, saying they stressed me out, that I needed to focus on what really matters. His words slipped into my mind like a warm, persistent whisper, convincing me that my loved ones were a distraction, that they didn't understand me the way he did. I found myself canceling plans without even thinking, laughing when I wanted to cry, trying to act as if everything was fine. I rehearsed responses in my head, words that would keep him at ease, hide my discomfort, and preserve the fragile peace I was desperately clinging to. My routine started to orbit around his whims. Meals were scheduled around his work hours. My rest times aligned with his sleep. My days molded into a pattern that felt safe, but at what cost? My mornings, once filled with my own thoughts, now echoed with his voice, sometimes in my head, sometimes in voice notes I replayed obsessively, as if listening could keep me anchored. But I often found myself questioning the echoes. Did I really say that? Or was it his version, twisted just enough to make me doubt my memory? I never said that, babe. You're misremembering again, he'd say, dismissing my confusion as if my mind was a faulty machine he was just trying to fix. The lines of reality blurred so subtly I barely noticed. I felt like wallpaper peeling in a room no one entered anymore. Faded, fragile, and on the verge of falling apart. My thoughts were muffled, like someone had turned down the volume on my life, leaving only faint echoes of who I used to be. I kept telling myself he was only trying to protect me, that his control was a form of caring, but deep down, I wondered if I was losing myself entirely. Was I still the person I once was, or just a shadow of her. I told myself I loved him, that I was holding on because I didn't want to lose what we had. But why did I feel like I was slowly disappearing inside it? Each time I stayed silent, each time I laughed when I wanted to cry, I wondered if I was choosing peace or surrender. And beneath that thought, a quiet, chilling question persisted. Was I still even myself anymore, or just a ghost trying to hold on to something that wasn't really mine? Every day, I found myself giving up a little more of what was mine. I deleted the social app one used to keep in touch with friends, telling myself it was for my own peace, that I didn't need the distraction. But deep down, I knew I was silencing the noise that kept me anchored. I told myself it was a choice, that I was protecting us, but the truth was, I was erasing parts of myself. Quietly, softly, without resistance. He never asked me to do these things outright. Instead, he'd say I used to be more loving, that I used to care about what I wanted. His words seeped in, unspoken but heavy. I felt guilty every time I hesitated, every time I let go of something I once treasured. I skipped my birthday dinner, claiming he didn't feel like going. It wasn't just about the celebration. It was about surrendering my own desires, giving him space to shape my world in the way he preferred. I felt a strange sense of relief, like I was making things easier for him. But at what cost? My own happiness blurred into a distant memory, replaced by a quiet obligation I was too exhausted to resist. I started hiding things too. A painting I loved, tucked away in a drawer, no longer on the wall where I once admired it. A hobby I used to indulge in, now abandoned because it felt trivial compared to the weight of his gaze. I avoided mirrors, not because I didn't recognize myself, but because I couldn't stand the reflection of someone I no longer knew. Every small act of concealment felt like a fragment of my identity slipping through my fingers, dissolving into the background of a life I was sculpting for someone else. He praised my silence, my compliance, telling me I was more caring now, more attentive. I'd smile when he looked at me, but I knew I wasn't smiling for myself. I was smiling because I was supposed to. The more I silenced my needs, the more I convinced myself that this was love, proof of my devotion. But inside, I felt a hollow ache, a growing distance from who I used to be. Was I still me, or just the version he needed me to be? I wondered if I had become an echo of his expectations, a shadow that faded in the light of his approval. Sometimes I caught myself thinking that I was doing this for us, for our future. Yet there was a voice, faint but persistent, that whispered I was losing myself entirely. I couldn't hear my own thoughts anymore, just the echo of his approval bouncing inside my mind. I smiled for him, but I don't think it reached my eyes. I was becoming the quiet, obedient shell of a person I once knew, and I didn't know how to stop. The more I gave, the more I felt myself slipping away, piece by piece. I wondered how much of myself I could hold on to before there was nothing left, before I disappeared completely, hidden behind the facade I was so carefully constructing. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning, an unraveling that no amount of effort could undo. I woke up to a world that felt unfamiliar, as if I had slipped into someone else's dream. The room was too quiet, the shadows too still, and my reflection was gone, replaced by a blank mirror that refused to show my face. I reached out, trembling, but my hand seemed disconnected, distant from the part of me that was supposed to recognize itself. My mind spun in circles, trying to grasp what had changed, but everything was slipping through my fingers like grains of sand. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of myself, an echo of who I once was, faint and fragile, buried beneath layers of doubt. I'd try to remember my own voice, but it sounded foreign, like someone else's whisper muffled in the dark. I'd wake up with no sense of what day it was, the memories of yesterday dissolving before I could hold on to them. It was as if I were living inside a fog that grew thicker with every passing moment, each thought dissolving into the void of his influence. He had begun to reshape my world, not with loud commands, but with subtle, precise edits, changing the wallpaper on my phone, erasing the photos of people I loved, replacing them with images that felt more appropriate. I found myself staring at the new screensaver, no longer recognizing my own reflection in the distorted glow. My journal had vanished, replaced by a fresh one with his handwriting on the first page, as if my past stories had been erased and rewritten by him. Even my music felt orchestrated, He deleted my playlists, replacing them with a single, haunting melody he made, one I felt compelled to listen to on repeat. Inside me, a war raged. One part clung desperately to the remnants of who I was, still trying to remember my dreams, my hopes, my laughter. But another part had surrendered, succumbing to the quiet voice whispering that I was better off following his lead. I found myself repeating his truths, justifications I once would have rejected, so seamlessly that I no longer knew which words belonged to me. It felt like I was being rewritten in his handwriting, every letter carefully crafted to erase my original script. Even my thoughts felt like they belonged to someone else now. I'd catch myself thinking, then immediately questioning whether those thoughts were truly mine, or just echoes of his influence. My mind was a fragmented mosaic, shards of my former self scattered across a shadowy landscape where I no longer recognized the person I saw in the mirror. If I could even find her anymore. I'd whisper in the silence, trying to find my voice, but all I heard was a faint, distant echo, an echo that was quickly fading. Sometimes, I'd catch a fleeting glimpse of clarity, an uncertain whisper that maybe I hadn't vanished completely. Maybe I still existed somewhere inside this fractured shell. But even that hope was slipping away. I no longer knew if I was still the girl who loved her life, or just a ghost living in a mirror that refused to show her face. My reflection was a stranger, and I was afraid that, soon, I wouldn't remember her at all. My reflection no longer moved in sync with me, as if it were a stranger watching from the glass. I stared, frozen, and watched my face distort. Eyes flickering, lips trembling, like a shadow cast in a mirror that refused to stay still. I reached out to touch it, but my hand met cold glass, and the image blurred, rearranged itself. It was as if the person staring back wasn't entirely mine anymore. An echo of someone I used to know. The handwriting on the last note I left, my handwriting, looked unfamiliar now, jagged and uneven. I read it over, trying to recall what I'd written. But the words felt foreign, twisted into something I didn't recognize. My memory of ink and paper was slipping away, dissolving into a haze of uncertainty. Had I written that? Or had he? I couldn't tell anymore. The lines between my thoughts and his manipulation blurred into a fog that refused to lift. I lost track of how long I'd been in this room. Minutes? Hours? I couldn't remember. The walls felt like they had shifted overnight, or maybe I'd shifted inside them. Everything was subtly wrong. Furniture rearranged, colors slightly off. The scent of my space altered like a dream I couldn't wake from. I noticed the photos on the wall, once familiar, now faded and missing faces, replaced by empty frames or strange, distorted images I didn't recognize. It was as if my history was being erased, replaced with a version he controlled. Sometimes I'd hear his voice, whispering when no one was near, echoing in my mind louder than my own thoughts. It was as if he had taken residence inside my head, rearranging my memories, rewriting my reality. I'd catch myself saying his words aloud, even when he wasn't there. His voice became my inner dialogue, louder than my own voice, drowning out the faint whispers of who I used to be. I started questioning whether these memories were mine, or just echoes he planted deep inside me, seeds of a false past I was supposed to accept. Dreams no longer felt like mine. They were governed by rules I never made, scenes that shifted before I could grasp them, each one tainted with his influence. I'd wake up feeling disoriented, unsure of what was real or fabricated. Even my sense of time was slipping away like grains of sand through my fingers. I clung to fragments, an old song, a childhood memory, that didn't fit the narrative he had crafted. They flickered like distant flames, faint but persistent, fighting to stay alive. Sometimes in the quiet, I would find a single object, an old photograph tucked behind a loose brick, a note in my handwriting I was sure I'd never written. It was a whisper of defiance, a tiny spark that told me I was still somewhere inside that chaos. I clung to it, trying to remember who I was before he rewrote my mind. I wondered if I was still in there, buried beneath layers of his influence, or if I had already disappeared completely. There was a flicker, a tiny, fragile hope, that maybe I was still me somewhere beneath the surface, waiting to surface again. I found that photograph, and for a moment, I felt it was a sign I hadn't fully lost myself. But then I looked again, and the image seemed to shimmer, as if it was just another illusion. I whispered to myself a faint prayer. Maybe I was still in there somewhere, but I'd need to remember before I forgot again. And deep inside, beneath the silence and the chaos, I could swear I heard a whisper, soft, almost inaudible, like a breath of hope. I clung to it, trembling, wondering if it was truly me or just another part of his silent manipulation. A wave of dread hit me like a punch to the gut, and suddenly, everything fractured inside. I was scrolling through my phone, desperate to find some proof, some shred of reality, when I stumbled upon it, a video file I had never seen before. My heart hammered as I pressed play, and the screen flickered to life. There he was, whispering into the camera, his voice low and intimate. But what chilled me to the bone was the conversation he didn't know I was recording. He was talking about me, about how easily he'd broken me, how I was just a project, a shell he could mold and discard. My stomach lurched, the world spun. I felt my mind split open like a fragile glass left in boiling water, shards raining down into darkness. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, trembling uncontrollably. The words echoed in my head, louder than any scream I could muster. I clutched my head, trying to hold the pieces together, but they slipped through my fingers, dissolving into chaos. The room blurred and then sharpened, as if I was watching myself from outside, detached and hollow. Then a memory surfaced, an old photo, faded and torn, but suddenly it didn't belong. It was from my childhood, a snapshot I'd kept hidden, and in it, I saw something I'd never noticed before. An unfamiliar face lurking in the background, watching me with cold, unblinking eyes. My breath hitched, and my vision blurred with tears. How could I have missed it? All this time, I thought I knew myself, but that face haunted me now, proof that something had been erased or manipulated. I looked around, desperate to cling to something real, but everything felt distorted, alien. My reflection was gone from the mirror, replaced by a dark, empty surface. The house, my life, everything I'd built, dissolving, shifting, as if someone was erasing it piece by piece. My mind spun faster, thoughts slamming into each other, each one more terrifying than the last. Had I ever truly been myself? Or was I already lost? A ghost wandering through a carefully constructed lie? The voice in my head was no longer my own. It was his, whispering, taunting, telling me I'd always been a fool, clinging to illusions. I wondered if I had ever known who I was at all, or if I'd just been pretending, playing along to keep the pain at bay. I felt a cold, creeping realization. What if I wasn't just losing myself? What if I had already vanished, swallowed by the shadows of his manipulation? A surge of panic burst through me, and I thought about running, screaming, tearing out of this nightmare. But I was rooted to the floor, frozen in a paralysis that felt like surrender. The walls around me seemed to close in, suffocating. I clenched my fists, trying to hold on to some fragment of sanity, but even that felt like a lie. I whispered my own name, trembling, trying to remember if it still belonged to me, or if I'd forgotten who I was so completely that I'd lost my voice altogether. Something inside me cracked, and for the first time, I didn't flinch when it did. I was on the edge, teetering between collapse and defiance, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. But for now, I simply stood in the silence, trembling, with my mind shattered and my soul desperately hanging on. I was making tea, the warm steam curling around my fingers, the quiet hum of the kettle filling the room. It felt normal for a moment, just a brief pause before the chaos I knew was lurking beneath. But then my phone buzzed. A message appeared out of nowhere, an unprompted, simple sentence that made my blood run cold. "Are you okay?" No name, no context, just those words, as if someone had been watching and finally decided to speak. I stared at it, trembling, my mind racing to make sense of the silence that followed. I scrolled through my photos, expecting to find nothing strange, but then I saw it, an image I didn't recognize. I was in a place I'd never been, a room with unfamiliar walls, a window with curtains I'd never seen before. And yet, I remembered standing there, or at least I thought I did. My reflection caught my eye, or what was left of it. The mirror, no, the reflection, wasn't mine anymore. It was distorted, almost mocking. My face looked different, softer, yet somehow colder. I tried to focus, but the lines blurred, the edges of my own image dissolving. as if I'd been erased but kept alive in some distorted version. I caught myself doing things I never consciously chose, my hands moving with a strange, practiced rhythm, brushing my hair as if I'd been told to, not because I wanted to. When I looked around, the furniture seemed altered, the shelves tilted slightly, the picture frames turned just enough to catch my eye but not enough to be accidental. That slight shift, that little flicker of movement. Was it me? Or something else? The room's silence was suddenly deafening. A distant, faint ringing filled my ears, an old, forgotten phone call I never made, echoing in my mind like a ghost. My closet revealed a dress I swore I'd never pick, hanging perfectly, untouched by my hand. Yet somehow, I knew I had worn it. And then I saw it, my handwriting. The notes I'd written myself, the things I'd thought I'd remembered, were altered, the ink smudged, the words rearranged. I could feel the subtle shift in my memories, a quiet erosion that I couldn't stop. A whisper of realization crawled up my spine. The love I'd believed in, the connection I thought I'd had, none of it was real. It wasn't love. It had never been love. It was control, obsession stitched into every word, every glance. Every "I love you" had been a lock clicking shut, a door I'd been led to believe was open. I wasn't seen. I was crafted, molded into a version he wanted, a puppet with a smile painted on. The truth hit me with a hollow, icy weight. I wasn't his partner. I was his creation, his possession. The love was a lie, a carefully constructed story written using my skin as paper. And I had been too blind, too scared to see the pages turning, the words twisting into something unrecognizable. I wasn't just trapped. I was erased, a fragment of myself slipping away, piece by piece, until only the shadow remained. A quiet, terrible certainty settled in. I was never truly free. The world around me, the memories I clung to, they all felt fragile now, as if they could crumble at any moment. I had no plan, only the desperate flicker of a thought. I had to break free. But from what? From him? From myself? The line blurred, and I knew I couldn't trust what I'd been told anymore. I was on the edge of losing everything. My identity, my mind, maybe even my life. And as I stared at the distorted reflection flickering in the glass, I realized with a sinking dread, this wasn't just a lie. It was a story he had written using my skin as paper. And I wasn't his. I never was. And that terrified him. I waited until the house fell silent. Then I moved, trembling with a mix of fear and desperate hope. My heart hammered so loudly I thought it might give me away. But I clenched my fists and reached for my phone, fingers trembling as I fumbled with the screen. I told myself I had to do this. Had to break free, even if just for a moment. I knew I shouldn't trust my instincts anymore, that they'd been twisted, reprogrammed to serve him, but I couldn't stay trapped inside my own mind forever. The idea of leaving, of telling someone, felt like a fragile thread I had to cling to. I slipped out of bed slowly, trying not to make any noise. My mind raced. What if he was already awake? What if he was watching me even now? Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist, whispering threats I couldn't quite hear, but could feel in my bones. I kept telling myself, don't think, just move. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, stiff and unsure. As I tiptoed toward the door, the hallway was darker than I remembered, an endless corridor of fear stretching before me. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling so badly it almost slipped. My pulse pounded in my ears. What if I was wrong? What if I'd already crossed a line I couldn't come back from? Even the silence around me felt like a trap, a carefully laid snare waiting to spring shut. My fingers shook as I finally turned the knob and pushed the door open, the faint creak sounding deafening in the stillness. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but my lungs felt tight, as if I'd forgotten how to breathe properly. I tiptoed into the living room, scanning for any sign of him, any sign that I'd been caught. My eyes darted to the corner where I'd seen a camera once, and for a moment I froze. Was he watching me right now? Did he know what I was trying to do? Every step felt like walking on shattered glass, fragile and dangerous. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms, trying to will myself to keep going. I had to break something, something that symbolized his control, something I could destroy and claim back a piece of myself. In a sudden burst of reckless determination, I grabbed the necklace he'd given me. It was heavy in my hand, cold and familiar. I yanked it free from around my neck, and as I did, it snapped in half, an almost satisfying crack as the chain broke apart. For a moment, I stared at the broken pieces, feeling a flicker of something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope, maybe, or just a moment of clarity. I tore a page from my journal, one I'd kept hidden, with my real name on it, and crumpled it in my fist, as if destroying the last remnants of the person I used to be. But even as I stood there, trembling, clutching the torn pieces of my past, a cold realization struck me. I wasn't free. Not yet. My body was still trembling, my mind still on the brink of collapse. I hadn't escaped the control, only momentarily escaped the illusion of it. I could still feel him, unseen, lurking just beyond the edges of my consciousness. And I knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The final confrontation was coming, and I was still unprepared, still vulnerable. I had cracked the glass, shattered the surface of my prison, but I could still see him staring through it, waiting, watching, ready to pull me back into the darkness. I didn't run. Not yet. I just stood there, trembling, the weight of everything crashing down on me. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst from my chest. The room felt colder, every shadow stretching longer as the silence thickened. I looked around, trying to anchor myself, to find some fragment of strength I could hold on to. My hands trembled as I clutched the torn piece of jewelry I had ripped from his grasp. My symbol of control, of resistance. He was there, watching me, his eyes calm but dangerous, like a predator calculating his next move. I could see the flicker of something dark behind his gaze, satisfaction, maybe, or the dull glow of a man who believed he had won. But I refused to break. I refused to let him see how much he'd already shattered me. Then suddenly he spoke. His voice was low, almost gentle, but laced with menace. You can't escape what's real. You've always known that. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning I was only beginning to understand. His gaze flicked to the journal I'd hidden behind my back. My last act of rebellion, the one thing I thought I still had. But I knew better. Nothing was safe from him anymore. I looked at the mirror across the room, realizing how much I'd avoided my reflection these past weeks. Today, I finally faced it. I stepped forward slowly. My reflection was gone. Completely. Instead, there was only an empty, cracked glass staring back at me. A fractured version of who I used to be. That mirror had once shown me everything. My fears, my hopes, my true self. Now it was just a void. I felt a strange mix of dread and relief. Maybe in losing that reflection, I was shedding the last of his control. In a surge of raw emotion, I reached out and tore the page from my journal, ripping it into pieces. Words I'd written, confessions, fears, memories scattered to the floor like broken glass. I whispered my own name aloud, the sound foreign but freeing. For a moment, I thought I might cry, but I held it in. I had to be stronger than this. I had to be. He lunged toward me, but I backed away, my heart pounding in my ears. I knew I couldn't stay. I had to leave the ghost of him behind. Every manipulative word, every lie, every shadow of the man I thought I loved. I looked around, searching for an exit, a way out of this nightmare. My mind was foggy, memories flickering like faulty film. His voice, the stolen moments, the lies I'd believed. And then I saw it, the door slightly ajar. I ran, not looking back. The cold air hit my face as I stepped outside, the rain washing over me, cleansing, but also reminding me of the storm I'd just escaped. I didn't know if I'd truly broken free, if I'd finally severed the chains, or if he was still lurking somewhere in the shadows of my mind. The haunting echo of his voice lingered, whispering in the back of my head, but I whispered my name louder, louder than ever before. Maybe I didn't survive him completely. Maybe I never would. But I survived this moment, this fight. As I walked away into the rain, I realized that even in the darkest silence, I still had a voice. And that was enough to keep me going, to keep me fighting. I walked away with nothing but a shattered journal and a battered heart, and somehow, that was everything. Because in the end I was still me, wounded, but unbroken. And I knew I would find my way back to myself, no matter how long it took.